Philosophy, I would argue, has always been important, and the most important in many ways, ethical and moral compass. But at the same time, since we are in School of Architecture, it's important to remind us that architecture cannot be applied philosophy. It's a different problem.
The issue among these two is who is going to circumscribe reality and what are the contents of reality.
Both Hernan and Jeff are absolutely right.
Philosophy would be no good to architecture if it basically just went a parallel path to architecture. It gets much more interesting when this sort of dialogue or multi-log starts to happen in a kind of curly-Q way. And I always think about the relationship between architecture and philosophy in this way. And I would say that this time in architecture is one of those times where it's not just a slight deviation from path, but that there are starting to become some strange eddies. So that was my first thought. I would say that that Žižek's ideas start to loop the far left and the alt-right around one another. By the way, I would say that these loopings are happening around the capital H, the human. Realize that the world is ultimately a kind of incomplete. But on the other side of this, you have Graham Harman talking about a world of objects. He posits that the world really is made up of things like the Milky Way, huge things. Can also be made by very small things, like a human, for instance. So humans are not left out of this. When I use the word object, he's not removing humans, they're objects. You have aircraft carriers. That's an object. You have pineapples. Mountain ranges. So one of the things about Graham's objects that makes them an ecology more than just independent or autonomous objects is that they signal to one another. And I'll just do my Aquaman signals here, showing them signaling to one another. That these things are not completely autonomous and non-relational, I think, although Graham uses that word. The idea is that there is a way of relating between these things, but they can never fully know one another. So in terms of communication, you have Žižek on the one hand, whose mode of communication is a critical mode, where he's constantly trying to identify contradictions, or he calls them antagonisms, within the political spectrum and the social spectrum, whereas Graham has really put his energy into figuring out how things which have a kind of autonomy can become parts of larger things, let's say assemblies of larger things, and also how objects can begin to communicate with one another without being totally beholden to this idea of relation.
Reality is constructed in the simple sense that what we perceive as social reality is different from one society, but I'm not a social constructivist. There is the real, there are traumas and so on. So my ultimate enemy even is this cheap deconstructionism, like everything is socially constructed. Yeah. We share this.
Except that the real is not reality and the objet is not my object.
The radical thinking of Graham is the world is not incomplete, the world is not undecidable, the world is not uncertain. The relationship between these two bodies of thought couldn't be less reconcilable. Graham cannot just include Slavoj's position, he actually has to reject it or defeat it. Slavoj will not let him by constantly agreeing with him and then incorporating his position as one of the attributes of undecidability in the Derridian sense, or uncertainty in the quantum mechanical sense, or even more important, the ineffable object A of Lacan.
Yes, I agree with you. Reality is out there, impenetrable. We cannot ever fully get at it. What if, and that's how in my naive way I read one of the lessons of quantum physics, what if this impenetrability is, and I mean this in the most radical sense imaginable, a feature of reality itself. Imagine a video game. You move in it, and you see some trees in the background, a forest. You cannot go there and see the forests, the trees from close up, because simply the game is not programmed in this way. If you come too close to the trees, you just see some vague dots, contours. Why? Because it's not part of the game, universe the way it's constructed, that you can go there. So in this wonderful reading that I like, it goes on like this, that the lesson of quantum physics is that God constructed our world like a lazy computer designer. He said, oh, in the same way that in a computer game, you know, it happens on a certain field where you kill Pokemons, fight, whatever, but you are not meant to go back close to that door, or the house, just the outside is constructed, because, so why should God lose time constructing the inside? I always think, maybe I am wrong, that the problem with O is for me that, okay, it's easy to say subject is ultimately just another object. In a certain way, of course it is. To be a subject means radically not to know what for an object I am. But that object is not out there, I cannot ever reach it. That object is myself.
To take the old example from Islamic philosophy, when fire burns cotton, the fire is not making contact with all the properties of the cotton, but only with a caricature or a translation or a distortion of the cotton. For me, the same problem happens when inanimate objects collide. So there's no direct contact possible in the inanimate world either, and so the same problem that happens in the subject happens in the inanimate world as well. Slavoj would say that we are seeking a re-enchantment of the world after the alienation of modernity, whereas I would say the world was never disenchanted in the first place. We've always been fascinated by the world. We've always been entangled with it and involved with it.
So we can just keep finding these clips and they'll add up and they become more and more interesting. But let me see if I can just summarize them for you. No matter what, Slavoj is not going to let go of an incomplete universe, not totalizable in its essence. That's his love of quantum mechanics. That's his love of the problem of diversity as a political requirement, or what he would call, let's say, the incompleteness of the subject, making it an unusual object, but also giving it the ability to try to incorporate and totalize the object. Whereas Graham will resist at every term. He will keep all objects complete. He will keep everything within its, not categorical boundaries, but it's, let's call it speciated, its living boundaries. So no matter how many clips we can show and they get more and more interesting, they're going to come back to the same point.
And I'm going to show this by making a parallel critique of Edward Said's. Edward Said, I could never say anything against him in Cairo because he was a kind of saint on campus. But there's a problem with his major book, Orientalism. There are several problems, but the problem I'm going to talk about here is at one point in the book, he relies on the argument that you can't generalize about the Orient. And of course, Orient's too big a term in its colonialist use. It referred to the Middle East and to the Far East and so forth. But leaving that aside, he says at one point in the book that you can't generalize, everybody's an individual, right? There are just a lot of individuals in the Middle East. You can't make a sweeping statement about what the Orient is.
That really brings something interesting to mind. Take a look at this.
You've got to think for yourselves. You're all individuals. Yes, we're all individuals. You're all different. Yes, we are all different. I'm not.
Then it occurred to me that that is close to the ontology of Margaret Thatcher. The fact is, we do try to learn things about culture as a whole. When I went to Egypt for the first time in 2000, there were a lot of things I had to learn about Middle Eastern culture. You can put your foot in your mouth if you don't. You have to learn a lot of things about what can be said, what can't be said. One of my students in Cairo who spoke fluent English had a night job telemarketing to the US, and he had to take a culture course about Americans. So I got to see that in reverse, and it was hilarious. They taught him you can't ask Americans if they're married, you can't ask them their salary.
What becomes very interesting, and I think interesting in particular for this audience, is what happens when they turn their attentions to the role of art and architecture.
The novelist J.G. Ballard, who said that the role of the artist has reversed in our time. He said in the past, the artist produced fictions. Now we're surrounded by fictions. The artist has to produce the reality.
Harman's resort to this inversion by J.G. Ballard, it's a play on tropes, it's meaningless. It's the only time they discuss fiction in the entire conversation, and avoiding the question of the artist is on both their minds right now, I think. Simply that neither of them knows how to cope with the question of the role of the artist today in relationship to their worldview and its political consequences. As they continue to think about art in general, they start to ask what is the nature of an art and how does it work? And this is when they raise the question of formalism.
I think we need a formalist move at the moment, as unfashionable as it is. We need to look at the building as cut off from its surroundings, just like we need to do with the artwork, but without the drawback of the earlier formalism, which is that it tried to exclude anything outside the work itself. That isn't always the case. Sometimes the work does let other influences permeate.
What do you mean exactly by formalism?
I suppose the way you could define formalism is that a thing is autonomous from its surroundings. That'd be the first step.
This issue of formalism, which will permeate their conversation on art and architecture, is one of the most interesting and open-ended problems of their discussion. What formalisms are they talking about, and how do they mean formalism?
Sometimes when I write about Tarkovsky, about Hitchcock, and so on, I try to be a formalist. I think that to get even at social context of Hitchcock, in my analysis of Psycho, I ask myself, because the whole tension of Norman Bates is he's literally a guy caught between the two. Traditional architecture, mother's house, and modern motel. But what if, because this is still a modernist opposition, what if we move into what, in popular terms, is called postmodernism, and imagine a motel which is itself flat but done with all the traditional kitsch ornaments, that you don't need mother's house up there. Mother house would be put as a mask on the motel itself. What would happen in that case with Norman Bates? You know, I rather don't think about it.
Right. The next clip we're going to see is when they start to turn their attention more specifically to architecture. The first finds Graham Harman grappling with the writings of Schumacher.
One of my favorite moments in Patrick's book is when he says, you know, every architectural theory has its vices, and I have to admit my vice is I don't know where to put the doors and windows, because everything's supposed to be a gradient and flowing naturally, and so it becomes kind of arbitrary way to articulate the building. And I think that's a serious problem. And David Rue, in a very nice piece that he wrote in TARP, Architectural Manual, a few years ago, talked about the worry that with the excessive concern with how the building flows into its environments, gradually, gently, without any discernible break-off, that architecture could blend into ecology and disappear, that everything could become about the carbon footprint, and there could be no autonomy to the discipline.
David Rui has pointed out that Schumacher's work is about a radical smoothness and continuity between architecture and the ground, architecture and the context. Graham goes to some effort to assert the autonomy of the architectural object and the importance of the autonomy of the architectural object, and it's independent from its actors' relationship and its contextual relationships.
In the arts, I happen to think that there is no art without a beholder. Even though Fried thinks that if an artwork exists only for a beholder, then it's too theatrical. I think theater is of the essence of art, and of architecture, by the way. I think that there needs to be a person there appreciating it, or it's not a work. I don't think after nuclear holocaust there's any art or architecture left. And so in that sense, the works close off, but they might close off with an observer, or they might close off with a socio-political effect in some cases, like Guernica or Uncle Tom's Cabin, or other works that are impossible to understand without the events that gave rise to them.
Here, he requires an actor or an audience to complete the being of an artwork or an architectural work. So, if you remember, his argument was that object-oriented ontology required no re-enchantment. And yet here he is arguing there is a need for countering the disenchantment. And for him, art and architecture do it only in their relationship with an audience.
Not long after Žižek and Harman's conversation, I had a chance to ask Graham to discuss his ideas about enchantment. Much of late 20th century philosophy states the urgent need for an authentic reenchantment and attempts various formulations to achieve it. Harman, on the other hand, argues that with Triple O's understanding of objects in and as the world, no such reenchantment is necessary because the world is always already enchanted.
Latour thinks that there's always been enchantment. People who claim that they're disenchanted or no longer naive are themselves naive in a new way. And it's funny to me in some ways that Žižek didn't acknowledge this because Žižek realizes this on other fronts.
Now, Derrida and Freud would call this an author using contradictory arguments in support of a desired conclusion, even though he's more willing and probably more courageous than any other philosopher to take on these questions directly. At this point, you're not seeing either of these philosophers trying to gain a positional edge on the other, but rather understanding that there's a lacunae, of intrinsic weakness in their own thinking that is exposed every time they turn their attention to either art or architecture.
You know what fascinates me in architecture? It's clear that they not only react to certain social problems, antagonisms, but they propose, for example, the new urban design and so on, separating place to sleep, place to work, place to have fun, as a solution to these problems. And second, this is why my arch enemy, if you ask me, and here Frank Gehry is not totally innocent, are, I think, one thing to bomb today are these public performative venues. You know, the idea is operas, concert halls shouldn't be just elitist operas. You should have their amusement parks, cafeterias, open public space. It's pure absolute lie. These are open spaces which are themselves isolated under the cupola and so on. The classical Stalinist architecture, wedding cake and so on. You know what fascinated me there so much? Something that in ideology you were absolutely prohibited to say. That Soviet Union claimed to be an egalitarian worker state. It was in reality an extremely almost neo-feudal hierarchic state. You just look at the buildings and you see it.
What he pointed out was that in the Soviet Union, the one art form that came under the most dictatorial pogroms of Stalin was architecture. When he finally decided that a social realist architecture would become the architecture of the state, Slavoj is turning his attention to this, celebrates the fact that architecture is able to expose the truth of Stalinism within the context of a Soviet regime. But I would like you to pay attention to the inability of each of these two thinkers and me to resolve the question of what is an art, a work of art, how does it do its work, how does it do its political work, how does it do its social, existential, and philosophical work, and the difficulty that all philosophers of the 20th century, including these two, have circumscribing that problem.
Yeah, that's
I graciously allow you to answer this one.